This is a Metro Talk, an initiative by Metropolis, the World Association of the Major Metropolises, in collaboration with its partners.
Welcome to MetroTalks. Today we'll be discussing metropolitan approaches to crisis and fragility. MetroTalks is a space for practitioners, for experts, for leaders to reflect on how to respond to the challenges and opportunities that our metropolises are facing. It's an open conversation, a fresh dialogue. We want to share ideas, to share views on the topic. Today is about metropolitan approaches to crisis and fragility. This series of MetroTalks builds on a call that was launched by Metropolis last year, which was, sorry if it's redundant, what's called a call to rethink our metropolitan spaces in light of the COVID-19. The call has already been endorsed by more than 30 local and regional governments and global entities and international agencies. Today, for the discussion, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. George Conway, Deputy Director of the Crisis Bureau at UNDP in New York, and Professor Mona Harb, who is a professor of urban studies and politics at the American University of Beirut. So thank you and for joining us today. And just to get started, we've seen that in many places the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated existing pressures. I mean, what we have realized is that some pressures on governance, on urban issues, on social issues, what we're witnessing is that maybe the COVID-19 is not confronting us to new problems, but as said before, it's exacerbating already problems that we had and pressures that we have, and some of the imbalances and questions that we haven't sorted out previously. We have realized that local and regional governments are the primary interface for the majority of people to access basic services and have a say in the decisions that affect their life. What we're witnessing in Metropolis is that many questions arise in terms of governance, in terms of how the teams within the public administration, local public administrations, interact between them, the approaches, the way the services deliver, and as well how, as said before, how the different layers of government that are have powers or have responsibilities in a given territory interact within them. So just to get started, a first question to both of you. From your perspective and your experience, how do you, I mean, what do you think are the main issues? You would say 2 or 3 issues that you see for metropolitan governance in cities are being affected or affect at the same time. I think that goes both sides, both directions, by crisis and fragility. How was as well the COVID-19 impacted these issues? And maybe it's related to my first question when I was saying in the introduction. Do you think that there are new problems in terms of governance and urban design, or what we're seeing is an exacerbation, as I said before, of these problems, and especially in context of vulnerability, fragility, and crisis? So who wants to get started? Maybe George, do you want to react?
Sure, and let me just start by saying that I'm thrilled to be part of today's conversation, and certainly it's a important time for this conversation. You know, given the impacts that COVID has had over the past year, in particular in urban environments, some of the highly concentrated impacts in these environments. And as you said, it does escalate prior trends that we've seen in countries affected by crisis and fragility, but it also brings its own unique challenges. There's no doubt on that. So I do think it's a combination of new risks and threats combined with and escalating existing fragilities. And we see, you know, that, for example, on health threats, where in fragile cities, you already had very limited access to municipal services, and that in many environments, these were very unequal in the first place in terms of their distribution. Those inequalities, existing marginalizations and exclusions are being exacerbated. And this is certainly a problem and something we need collective attention towards. So just by way of sort of highlighting the key issues and challenges that we do see, a lot of concern then around how decision-making happens. In fragile environments, they're often characterized by inadequate access to data, insufficient information, particularly where we've seen, and this is very much the case in many fragile countries, escalating trends of urbanization resulting from rural to urban migration, climate shocks impacting on food insecurity in rural areas, rural insecurity, ever escalating trends of urbanization that make it really difficult for municipalities to keep on top of the situation. So you get decision making happening in a way that often becomes inequitable, reinforces existing marginalization and exclusion, because those, in particular, internally displaced persons, are often those that have already been from amongst the most marginalized and excluded parts of the population as a baseline, and end up in peri-urban areas in highly concentrated camps where municipal service don't penetrate in the first place. But as recurrent decision-making happens, it happens in ways that don't necessarily meet the needs of these parts of the population. So certainly, you know, the types of availability of data on which decision-making happens is very important, because if decision-making isn't more inclusive, if it isn't more transparent about how services are planned and delivered, then it risks escalating existing fragilities in terms of compounding or breakdowns in trust, breakdowns in social cohesion, and fuels risks around corruptions and otherwise. More broadly, a capacity of municipal governance to manage these types of crises and shocks, both as a baseline, as well as where we see, you know, rapid and ever escalating shocks like we see in COVID-19. COVID-19, 90% of the cases we understand are in urban environments, as against 55% of global populations. And so there's a disproportionate set of caseloads that need to be supported and addressed. And in environments where fragile cities were not able, in the first instance, to meet the needs of citizens, you know, we see those needs ever escalating in very compromised capacity to keep up with the situation. And you know, the impacts of COVID themselves are impacting negatively on the capacity of municipal governance to respond. Estimates from the World Bank and other UN bodies suggest that local governments may lose up to a quarter of their revenues in 2021 as a result of the secondary impacts of COVID-19. And this is only going to further undermine sustainable urban development, public service delivery, and infrastructure. So these do create a number of very challenging circumstances. That said, many cities are stepping up to these challenges and are uniquely placed as first responders and as the principal interface between citizens and the state, and hence the crux of the social contract to respond. And many cities are showing that they're hotbeds of innovation. They're engaging in intellectual exchange and generating new ideas to show how inclusive and well-targeted responses can achieve better impacts to build resilience, social cohesion, and sustaining peace. And for this reason, UNDP is heavily invested in supporting municipal governments in this respect. Approximately 500 million of our programmatic delivery is in urban environments, is supporting local governance in 84 countries, with a really strong focus on capacity development, including on crisis management, and practical tools to support innovation amongst municipalities, and more than ever in this past year in the COVID-19 response. Thanks.
You said, no, I think you raised quite questions. One is true that we forget, or we tend to forget, that this crisis of the COVID-19 crisis, on the one hand, it happens when we're coming already for another crisis, the social, economic, and financial crisis of 2008, that had an impact, different impact in different regions of the world. So we have now this crisis, but this crisis is also happening, as you said, in territories, in cities. They were already currently they were undergoing other crises and fragilities, maybe unstable governments, cities that are based in territories where there are civil wars or tensions. There are also natural disasters situations. So there are this context. Then you said as well, one of the problems is decision making. I don't know as well if we could add not only decision making, because what you were saying at the end, that you said that cities, city leaders are turning up to be the ones who are taking leadership, who are taking decisions. So maybe this issue of leadership as well is critical, and especially in context of crisis and fragility. I don't know. I think Mona, you have this interesting background. No, you are urbanist, and you also you're an expert in politics. So, how do you think these links between crisis in cities, the design of the city, and the governance of the city, and linking to what George said before about this? It's an issue of decision making. It's a leadership issue because normally is we think in terms of resources, only in terms of resources and capacities, and we forget all this framework. But I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's an important question. Thanks, first of all, for having me. I'm very happy to be here and to engage in this important conversation. I want to start by saying that the pandemic does not reverberate across countries in the same way. In countries that already are experiencing social, economic, financial, political crisis, the pandemic seems to be, I want to say, even to be provocative, the least of the worries of populations, especially the most vulnerable. People say openly that their worry is how to find money to put food on the table rather than worrying about catching a virus. So I'd like to respond to your question about the main issues in relation to cities affected by crisis and fragility, linking it to multiple crises, to contexts where the pandemic comes to aggravate situations where already societies are suffering from compounded crisis. I come from Lebanon, where the past year has been a crucial year of economic and financial collapse, in addition to a profound political crisis. And the pandemic comes to top all this. So dealing with multiple crises at the same time is extremely difficult, especially for the most vulnerable, who unfortunately are forming more and more a higher percentage of the population, the majority of the population. And here I'd like to make a couple of points.
Yeah. I'm sorry, if may I interrupt you? I mean, that's really interesting that you're based in Beirut, because on the one hand, you said all the economical crisis that Lebanon was under following, the political crisis, that it looks like it's never ending political crisis, not the civil war, but the tensions, the social tensions, and that are there. But additionally, there was as well the city of Beirut. They suffered this catastrophe with the explosion in the harbor. So it's
Absolutely.
like everything is getting there in that city in Beirut. So how? I mean, that's example of the situation of layers of vulnerability and crisis.
Yes, it's like it's extremely difficult. I mean, I've experienced the civil war, and I'm a resident of Beirut since my birth. So it's as a resident here, I can attest, even though I'm among the most privileged who live here with an available job and a roof above my head, that the situation is extremely difficult on the majority of the population. And the worst, I would say, is that political legitimacy crisis, and the fact that we actually do not have public institutions that are accountable and reliable to manage a crisis and to put forth the interest of people up there. So I think there's a very important assumption we're making by assuming that we have local governments that are representative, that have been elected according to democratic rule of law, which is not the case, not only in Lebanon, but I think in many places around the world, where we have political systems that do not produce accountable democratic local governments, and that where the system produces local governments and municipal councils that are deconcentrated authorities rather than being decentralized governments, and that serve the central state and more specifically the interest of the state institutions. And here we have to remember that that in the context of post-colonial states that have undergone a lot of crises, be it civil wars or political rivalries and conflicts, the public institutions themselves have been captured by political and private interests. So they serve the interest of a political class rather than serving the interest of people. And so it's very hard to find public institutions that work for the benefit of the population. And this becomes a major challenge. And I'd like to raise that as an issue in response to what you're saying. I mean, by definition, we know that there's a public good that is supposed to be protected by public institution, a public interest, a common good that is supposed to be advanced and furthered by the work of public institutions and local governments includingly. And we don't have public institutions and local governments that do that. Who protects the public good in such a case? When public institutions, state institutions, local governments, regional governments, metropolitan authorities are parasited by the interest of political actors and other actors that advance their business interest and their private interest, who protects the public good? I think that's a key question in such context. Can the public good be protected by other parties besides a state institution? I'm not sure this is possible. We have many cases, and I'm sure George could talk to that, about situations where the public could, I mean, it is defended by civil society organizations, by activist groups, even by oppositional groups, but there's a limit to the work of these oppositional groups, and there are a lot of limitations. I know that in Lebanon, the urban activist dynamics are extremely strong, and they have managed to protect the public good in more than one instance, but there's a limit to how far they can reach. So yes, crises aggravate a lot these situations, including the situations of state capture, the situations of poor democratic representation and accountability. We don't have an independent judiciary system that could ensure processes of accountabilities and good governance, and it becomes extremely hard to operate in these conditions of very limited governance and accountability.
And additionally, if you put that as well, because in this crisis and fragility normally happens more in territories where they have certain history, normally more in poor territories as well. But additionally, it's interesting in terms that in these territories as well, where urban development is more accelerated. I mean, we see the expansion of metropolises, the biggest metropolises, take place normally in impoverished territories or with many problems, additionally to these problems of governance. And then with the metropolitan perspective, at least this is what we see in Metropolis, is even more complex, because the metropolitan territories, at the end of the day, sometimes you don't know who is governing, who is managing, who is thinking the metropole and the future of this metropole. Do you have as well the same feeling, George, that's the critical issue is the governance of these cities, and of course the links within their territory?
I do, and I think that's right, but I also think it's quite uneven. I mean, I just before I took on this job in New York a year ago, I was in Mogadishu for 6 years, and a country context which has been characterized for some 30 years with its ungovernability. What we see in the country these days is that municipal environments are becoming locuses of stability in otherwise ungovernable territory. And so when you do have climate shocks and food insecurity and rural insecurity where non-state armed groups run rampant, they come to the urban environments, because those are the places that they can at least access a modicum of services and employment in the informal sector. And for this reason, we've seen massive rates of acceleration of urbanization in the past decades. There are towns in Somalia that have doubled in size over the course of the last decade, which places extraordinary strain in terms of service delivery. But people see these places as places that they can go to access a better protected environment. And at least a greater amount of access to social services than would have been the case in remote rural environments.
But so may I interrupt you, because what you're saying is really, it would look like a paradox. So I'm not sure if it's a paradox, because on the one hand, you say that this in fragile territories, we could say that urban spaces grow maybe faster because it's a place where people feel safe. As you said, you said, if I properly understood, that people feel that they can access to certain basic services, maybe even education, and they feel even maybe more protected that they live in the small town. But at the same time, we have what Mona said, that about these big spaces, metropolitan spaces, they lack the governance side. And sometimes they grow without control. There's no one planning the city. So it looks like I don't know if it's a paradox, but kind of, the people go to the urban spaces because they feel safe, but at the same time, these urban spaces, they don't have the governance conditions and the planning conditions to make them safe. I'm not if I'm being clear about what I'm saying. I'm not, is it a paradox or it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, just to jump in on this, I mean, I'm not sure. I think it is a bit of a paradox because people come for a safer environment and an expectation that they can better access services, although understanding that the baseline of both security and service delivery is already quite low. But that said, I agree with you that it does fuel negative governance trends. Again, to keep on that same example of Somalia and the rapid rates of rural-urban migration and forced displacement, what happens is in the absence of formal or effective governance systems, informal and often kleptocratic informal governance arrangements materialize. In Somalia, we have this so-called gatekeeper phenomenon, where informal protective structures evolve that are linked into local armed groups and whatnot that then start to interface with both the formal structures and with the international community and become a gatekeeper for access of resources to those communities. And that's a hard thing to chip down against because in the Somali context, it's been very deeply entrenched over a very long time. So actually being able to access the right populations in ways that you can hear people's voices and understand their needs has been a key priority. And it is something that, for example, in Mogadishu, we've worked very much with the municipal government and with the district commissioners to increase public outreach and direct avenues to understand what people's needs are, to get around these kleptocratic structures that otherwise are preying on various humanitarian development resource streams in ways that aren't able to fully support the needs of the population.
And makes me then ask something to Mona. According to what you said, because that's a reality, but at the same time, how do you handle, from a urban perspective, the design of these urban spaces, especially like big cities like a capital like Beirut, and especially territories that you have the feeling that you're all the time rebuilding the city. You cannot not even plan the city of the future. You only keep on rebuilding the city and trying to reduce the vulnerability. So how can you think in terms of urban plan, urban design? Because in Metropolis, for example, we thought that the basis of good governance is, as we said before, leadership, but we also talk about vision for the territory. How do you see your metropolitan space? What do you want your metropolitan space be in the future? And of course, how you can think about it if you are on everyday basis just handling needs, problems, and short-term situations?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, I'll start by saying that we have the municipality of Beirut does not even have a city planning unit, does not even have a base map of its of the city. So they don't even know who lives where and who does what. So even the base of data that George mentioned earlier as being like the ABC through which planning should start is inexistent. It's inexistent not because people don't know that it should be there or we don't have the resources to do it. It's simply because there's no interest in planning. The planning is mainly about building regulations. So it's about regulating floor to area ratios, and it's about maximizing the value of land for its exchange value rather than its social value. So what happens in the absence of a city planning unit that would have the vision you're mentioning is that real estate interests take over and developers develop the city. So market interests develop the city according to a building law that advances their interests, and it gives you the urban landscape that Beirut has today. High-end towers that block the sea view and shade the streets, very poor infrastructure of public spaces because there was no planning of to protect any green open spaces. Even green open spaces get sold. There's no reflection of planning at a city scale of how to devise affordable housing to people who would need that. There's no public transportation system that's effective. So urban sprawl takes over. Real estate developers buy land, build buildings, sell buildings at various prices depending where the land is to people who migrate to the city, and then you end up with a metropolitan area that is extremely sprawled, congested, very poorly connected to each other, not well serviced at any level in terms of infrastructure. Our indicators of infrastructure are dismal. If there is any investment in infrastructure, it gets misplaced and displaced to other needs that are most of the time the needs of private business contractors rather than benefiting the need of the city. So we don't have a waste collection system that works. We don't have a waste management system that works. So it all collapses because of what has been termed in Lebanon a laissez-faire attitude towards urban policy making. It's a very minimalist attitude towards managing urban space, an absence of recognition of urban planning as a tool to advance the interest of people living in the city, and a lack of political will. It's not a priority on the list of people. So it's taken over by real estate speculation that serves the interest of a small group, a small network of business interests connected to political interest, very much the kleptocratic system that George mentioned, that we see in many, many areas of the global south that dominate and that benefit a small group of people, the few, at the expense of the many.
So you would say that it's only, then in this case, you only have a technocratic approach to the problems in terms of,
not even it would be even an engineering approach, and an approach that privileges infrastructure, because this is where the cash cow is found in terms of procurement and contracting, rather than an approach to planning the city. So highways, bridges, underpasses. We did have, Beirut is known for its post-war reconstruction project that happened in the 1990s, and that was led by a billionaire ex-prime minister who was assassinated in 2005, Rafiq Hariri, who rebuilt the downtown of Beirut using a real estate agency, a private real estate agency that took over a very big portion of the city, the old city center of Beirut, and redeveloped it into a glitzy urban center. And this is where you would see very nice example of urban design. A lot of students used to come to Beirut and visit this the city center because it included a lot of examples of urban heritage that was restored in very professional ways. And there was this vision of rebuilding the city and replacing Beirut as a city, as an attractive city in the Middle East. And also this vision brought a lot of capital from the Gulf and from Saudi Arabia, among others, to invest in the city. We have a lot of star architects who came and built beautiful buildings, but it ended up being an empty museum. And today, this is the site of the protest. This is the site where people go and protest and demand a more democratic government. That denounce the kleptocrats and the oligarchy that rules us. So it has become a site of protest. It has been vandalized. It has been secured, extremely secured by military mechanisms. So even that attempt at post-war reconstruction that placed Beirut at some point on a map of an example of a city that built itself after the civil war ended up being a bad example because it never engaged people. It took over the land of original owners and gave them to a private real estate company. It became an example of neoliberal urbanism that again puts profit at the expense of people's interests.
And in fact, what we're discovering, and it's cities from all around the world, on the global north, the global south, is not only about, as you said, I was saying about technocracy, you were saying engineering. It's not about, I understood that for many years we've been thinking the development of big cities and metropolitan areas as an issue of infrastructures, investing in infrastructures. And what we've seen because of the COVID is it's not only about infrastructures, it's about vision, it's about policy, it's about what are you expecting, hearing about citizens' needs as well. And as well it's about values. When you design your city,
absolutely,
there are values behind that. And that makes me go to the same question for the two of you. Well, it's a double question related to the governance thing, because I think all the time we're going back we're talking about this context of crisis and fragility, about the governance issue as a critical one. So on the one hand is how we can, international agencies like UNDP, in networks of local governments like Metropolis, other actors, international actors, how they can contribute to reinforce this local governance in order to have then a proper urban development of metropolitan spaces. And the other way around is how we can work in a context when the governance is in crisis. In a city, how we can work, for example, Metropolis or UNDP with a city where the governance is in crisis. So it's how we can reinforce the local governance and how we can work with cities where the governance is in crisis. I don't know, George, do you want to start, George? Or, well, feel free to react to each other as well. I mean,
I mean, it's an interesting and difficult question. You know, to a certain degree, you know, along the scale of fragility, whether cities are more stable or more fragile, or how much they've been impacted by you know, recent threats like COVID-19, basic challenges remain the same. The cleverness with which we address the challenges is something that we need to ever focus on. You know, how do you source an understanding of demand from citizens? How do you understand the citizen perspectives? What are the mechanisms through which you can do that in equitable ways? Is a first really key issue, and this is as valid in, you know, the most stable cities in the world as it is in the most fragile, just more difficult, and it has to factor in more challenges. But with current digital trends, for example, we've got lots of good examples of how we can support municipal governance to put in place planning and engagement systems that are able to much more readily engage with people that wouldn't have had a voice previously. In Afghanistan, for this reason, we're working with service delivery systems to ensure they're more inclusive, accountable, and transparent. We're supporting 22 provincial and district municipalities with a really strong focus on feedback loops to ensure conflict-affected and otherwise under-resourced populations have their needs addressed. Working with the local councils to develop public grievance mechanisms to ensure that the public has opportunity for feedback into service delivery and can inform of challenges and issues that need to be addressed. Certainly, the issues of how can we support municipalities to strengthen data utilization in order to make smarter public investments, you know, based on evidence, based on data, based on what works, including, for example, to address issues around social cohesion and violence. We have a really good engagement in Central America with USAID, a program called InfoSegura, where we work at a regional level to improve data production, analysis, and use for evidence-based, conflict-sensitive decision-making on public policies for citizen security. So again, there's really good examples out there that we need to learn from, aggregate, share, because part of the issue here is, and this is where we have a lot of good collective opportunities amongst us, to share peer-to-peer learning between cities. Where cities are finding, you know, clever, innovative, data-based, making best use of current digital trends, solutions to these issues, to help cities help themselves and to find opportunities to share information laterally. So this likewise is something that we as UNDP and the UN more generally are quite invested in order to make those links, to share those experiences, share those lessons, and empower municipalities to promote their own novel solutions. We administer a city-to-city network as a mechanism for exactly this. It's a peer-to-peer learning platform to bring cities together and work with experts to design solutions to the extraordinary challenges that they're facing in urban environments these days.
Do you think, and well, if you want to add on that, Mona, please add, and additionally, do you think that taking part, for example, the city of Beirut, taking part in international networks of local governments could helps to introduce the changes that you were commenting before, you were telling us before?
Well, this is a very difficult question because the problems, if we qualify them, they're structural problems. They're problems related to systemic inequalities that are political, economic foremost. So international assistance can do so much. You know, I wish that international assistance can come in and ensure, you know, solid public institutions and an independent judiciary that is the base guarantee for everything George said. I agree with, for the sake of time, I'm not going to reiterate what George said. I think he summarized it very well. What I will add is that in these fragile contexts where there has been a state capture of public institutions and the public resources and natural resources at the expense of the majority of the population. What I wish that international support comes and do is bring back a discourse about the importance of building independent state institutions, building city planning units within local governments. As I said, in Beirut, in Tripoli, in most of the city of Lebanon, but also all around the Middle East I'm most familiar with, there are no effective city planning units inside local governments. Municipal councils cannot operate without a planning unit. Urban planning expertise needs to be leveraged and valorized. It exists now in these cities. They're working, most of them, in the private sector. They need to be serving municipal councils and work in the public sector. International cooperation can help in furthering this message, can help making it a condition that the aid that they would provide should come to a platform that brings together this, not only this expertise at the level of urban planning, but also civil society activists that are working with vulnerable groups, grassroots initiatives that are quite innovative, find ways to leverage the informal sector. We mentioned that earlier, rely on participatory methodologies to engage people in the design of these response agendas. We have very dynamic and very vibrant societies that are serving themselves in the absence of a state that serves them. We need to leverage this, but do it in intelligent ways that also help rebuild the public good from the public state. We cannot do it from outside all the time. I think an approach that privileges data, as George was saying, but also that privileges a spatial approach, a neighborhood-based approach, is very useful and can give a lot of positive impact. In Lebanon, we're working with UNDP at the Beirut Urban Lab, where I'm associated, in a neighborhood that was severely affected by the blast. And there are promising results that we're seeing. We're developing citizen science methodologies. We're working slowly. We're not in a hurry to find solutions that can be visible to everyone, but we care more about the process, and this process, crafting it very slowly with the like-minded people who has these values that you mentioned earlier, that share these sets of values of social justice, inclusion, equity, ecology, environmentally responsible interventions. All this can help bring a platform, but that platform needs to be associated to the public institution, to a local government. If it's floating like this, it will not be sustainable.
Thank you, Mona. I think with your words, you have summarized most of the points of our discussion today. I'm afraid, as the song says, time goes by so quickly that we have just, it's been so intense and so many things have gone that we have already covered the time of the discussion. Something you said that I keep as well is the issue of citizens. You mentioned we shouldn't forget that even in fragile cities, in fragile metropolitan spaces, there are vibrant communities, there are vibrant citizens that they want to do things, and they are committed to work together. They're already working, and also they can work together with local governments in developing the city. So thank you very much, George Conway, Deputy Director of the Crisis Bureau at UNDP in New York, and thank you, Professor Mona Harb from the American University of Beirut. Thanks a lot.